Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 26 of the American Pageant titled The Great West and the Agricultural Revolution from 1865 to 1896. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. To start off, here are the key concepts for this chapter. As I always say, you should definitely try to match the key terms to the key concepts here because it will really help you prepare for the AP exam. Basically trying to organize information based on different time periods and subtopics within those time periods. So I definitely think it's worth doing if you have the time, and I highly recommend you do it. So to start off, let's talk about conflicts with Native Americans. As the US is going to expand westward, there will be really invasion of Native American lands, and this is going to be met with some resistance. In fact, you should note that by 1890, most of the land in the West had become states, with the Indians still owning a small portion of the land that greedy pioneers soon encroached upon, and they obviously spread fatal diseases, which leads to increased conflicts on the frontier. But tensions will rise as we see the implementation of the reservation system, and although it was initially designed to pacify the Indians and prevent frontier conflict, it ultimately promoted separatism and gave Native American tribes land with certain designated boundaries. So tribes would share land communally, and they would have to stay within a certain area, a certain radius of area, but the government would make everything violent, would instigate conflict by coercing the tribes to stay in that radius at all times. And this was really, contradicting the nomadic lifestyle of the natives. They weren't used to staying in one place. They were always moving. They never really settled. So this is completely contradicting their lifestyle, and this is going to be especially troublesome for Native Americans. And yet, despite everything they went through, Native Americans continued to surrender land somewhat peacefully to the white settlers because they were promised by the federal government that they would get food, clothing, and other basic survival things that they would need in order to survive in their reservation without having to move outwards and hunt and gather and all of that. However, because many of these federal officials were so corrupt, they purposefully gave them bad supplies or no supplies at all. So it was becoming increasingly difficult for them to actually survive. But ultimately, all of these building tensions lead to the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. This one started when white settlers searched in native reservation territory, which was guaranteed to the Native Americans. No one would invade that territory. That was the deal. White settlers go in there looking for gold. And obviously, the white settlers, they try to suppress the natives, and the natives are obviously angry, so they try to fight back. And in this case, they successfully fight back against Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry, and they actually completely kill them, really. They successfully fight back, and it marks a rare native victory. And although the tribes were unable to really remain together in fighting back the white settlers, it shocked the US, and the army hunted down the natives who did it. So again, although this is a relatively little victory for the natives, it's sort of like this big siren. That's how I think of it. It's a little victory, but it's a big horn. It's a big siren for the US, and it's essentially alerting the white settlers and sort of serving as a wake-up call for them. Oh my God, we can't just keep taking advantage of the natives now because they know how to fight back, and we are now possibly in danger. So they're going to be a lot more aggressive in regards to attacking Native Americans later on. And unfortunately, this will lead to a horrible massacre, as we'll talk about in just a bit. Some other conflicts you should know about. The Nez Perce Indians tried to escape their reservations. They didn't want to be confined anymore. They wanted to live their nomadic lifestyle, which they were obviously used to. And they were eventually captured, but the government promised to return them to their ancestral lands. Instead, what ended up happening was they sent the Indians to another reservation where many of them died of disease. And with all of these conflicts, the government's soon going to realize that it's a lot more expensive to fight the natives when they're acting as a separate sovereign nation, and they should instead be really forcibly assimilated into American society, because then at least they could be somewhat controlled by the government. So that's really what they're going to do. They're going to try and assimilate the natives so that they're easier to control and manipulate. Speaking of assimilation, let's talk more about that and what exactly that means. Assimilation is, in terms of the Native Americans at least, is where they were forced to give up their cultural beliefs and nomadic lifestyle to adapt to the American lifestyle. So this really contradicts how, immigrants are treated, for example, like Southern and Eastern European immigrants, as we talked about in the last chapter. They held on to their own cultures and beliefs, and those even became a part of the American lifestyle. They sort of became a new addition and they were celebrated. But Native Americans, when they wanted to give their cultures and beliefs, they were not allowed to because it was seen as dangerous or could possibly start a conflict. So the federal government wants them to wipe away their culture and their beliefs and their values and just, have whatever they want them to have, if that makes sense. They don't want Native Americans having any sort of sense of culture, at least as they're adapting to the American lifestyle. So obviously, for this reason, assimilation was a very controversial thing, and so debate arose as to whether this should be done through encouragement or brute force. So would Native Americans be encouraged or even rewarded for giving up their old lifestyle and adapting to this American one, or would they be forced into it whether they like it or not? And the ultimate goal of the government was to assimilate the natives. There was no, okay, the natives are going to stay here and we're going to stay here, because they didn't think that worked. It still led to conflict. So they thought, well, okay, we'll just integrate them into society, and whatever we have to do that by, whatever means we have to do that by, we will do. And for the Native Americans, this was a very difficult thing to grapple with because sometimes assimilation was necessary for their own survival. So for example, when Christian reformers who provided educational facilities on the reservations, when they came to visit the Native Americans, they would withhold food until the natives agreed to give up their cultural beliefs. It's absolutely horrible and disgusting that the natives were forced to give up their values and assimilate into this Christian one, and they were, basically threatened with their life. Their life was hanging in the balance if they didn't assimilate with whatever these Christian reformers said. And they even got the government to prohibit the holy sun dance, which was very integral in their society and their beliefs, and this was eventually banned by the government. However, after the government banned the sun dance, the Native Americans created something known as the ghost dance, and it was essentially created by the Sioux, and it was sort of like a religious revival because the Native Americans believed it would help them return to their former prosperity and get the white settlers off their land. It was sort of like this rebellious yet religious revival that allowed the Native Americans to hold on to some hope despite their worsening situation and their forced assimilation that they're going through. However, the federal government continued to see this as an obstacle to assimilation and quote-unquote progress by inflaming hatred against the white settlers and instilling hope that they would once again be free. So the government does not want Native Americans to think that they will ever be a sovereign nation again. They think that assimilation is the only way to go from here on out, and that this ghost dance, this really important ritual to the Sioux and the Native Americans in general, that this was going to be almost preventing that in a way. And so to stop the ghost dance, the government violently attacks the natives at Wounded Knee, and this becomes known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. So in 1890, the U.S. Army goes to the Dakotas to stop the new ghost dance, and this is also over tensions over whether or not the land would be separated under the Dawes Act, which I'll talk about later. But this massacre leads to the deaths of over 200 natives, and this was the last major battle on the Native American frontier. So the natives are just completely destroyed, really, by this event. It was just absolutely horrific. And I also included these little pictures and gifs here because I think it really helps visualize what exactly assimilation is. If you look at the picture on the left, for example, the federal government is like the red person painting those gray people. They don't want them to have any sort of their previous cultures and beliefs. They don't want any of that showing through. They want them to be, this ideal, quote-unquote, American. They don't want them having any sort of culture other than the one that has already been established. So they're literally painting them by means of like assimilation. And then obviously the Native Americans, they're like, I want to be alone, I need privacy, we don't want this. But at this point, it's not really a choice. The government briefly considered that maybe assimilation would just be sort of something you would encourage, but ultimately it became something that they did through brute force, and it was just absolutely horrible. Okay, so now let's talk more about the West and the distinctly Western lifestyle that's going to develop as we're going to see these regional differences between the North and the West and the South also develop. And there will even be some regional similarities between all of these regions, but it's really important that you know why and how they occur. Before we get into that, let's talk about the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. I mentioned this in the last slide, and it's really, really important that you know this one. Essentially, it broke up Indian reservations, ending tribal ownership of the land. So in other words, the very little land that Native Americans got to live on, that the federal government provided them, that wasn't even owned by them anymore. The federal government owned it. And the remaining land was sold, and the money would be used to fund the US efforts to, quote, civilize, or in other words, assimilate the natives. So for example, they funded the Carlisle School, which taught natives English and white virtues and customs, trying to get rid of their cultures and beliefs. And if the natives did all of this, if they followed all the directions, they would then get citizenship and the titles to their lands in 25 years. So if they followed all the rules to a T, then they would get the land that they were on first, which is just horribly messed up, first of all. And this act in general just really goes to show how greedy the US is becoming. They're trying to expand westward and trying to occupy more land. They think they're entitled to land that wasn't even theirs to begin with. And really, the small part of land that the natives are asking for isn't even guaranteed to them. So they are going to be really detrimentally affected by this act. Okay, so moving on, let's talk more about the major industries in the West, because it's really important in understanding the distinctly Western lifestyle that's going to develop, and it's just in general important to know about the regional economy there. For example, one really important industry is the mining industry, and this really peaked in 1858 when gold and silver were found in the Rocky Mountains, and many of the pike peakers came in search of the precious metals and minerals, bringing both wealth and people to the West. So kind of like the California gold rush, people are in search of precious metals, they're trying to make quick cash, and to do that, obviously it requires people, so there's going to be a huge population rush, and in general, some people will profit from this. However, because of the expensive operational costs and the massive amounts of equipment that you need to successfully mine, mining soon became a big business with many investors in it. And with all of this new silver and gold that's being discovered, it's allowing the Treasury to continue specie payments, which means payments of silver in 1879, which again made it an issue in American politics, which again we'll talk about in a bit. Okay, so now I'm going to briefly review the Homestead Act of 1862 because it's mentioned in the chapter, and it's also pretty important that you know about it. So essentially, the act offered land to people who lived on Western land for 5 years or more and improved it in some way. So improving meaning like built a house, farmed on it, something. And although it encouraged people to settle in the West, sometimes the land wasn't really fertile. You couldn't really do much with it. And the cost of supplies to maintain it was incredibly high. So this will also impact native life as more people are beginning to settle in the West and they're encroaching on their land. So although the government does do this to try and bring more people west, and although it works to some extent, they aren't really benefiting much because the land is pretty much unusable. And meanwhile, Native Americans are being detrimentally impacted by this because more people are settling, which means more people need more land, and ultimately they won't have much space in terms of, where they can go without getting into conflicts. And because the West is so heavily reliant on agriculture, they're going to rely on machines to do a lot of the work for them, and this is known as the mechanization of agriculture. So essentially, it's describing the growing reliance on machines like the combine and the twine binder in farm work. And these machines increased the productivity of the land, but were also incredibly costly. So although it did allow for a greater production of crops, it was also very costly to maintain, and this will become a problem, as we'll see later on, because farmers will go into debt buying these machineries, and then it will be hard for them to sell their crops at a really high price because there's a lot of them. So with a lot of supply, there isn't a lot of demand and the prices will lower, but we'll talk all about that in a little bit. And you should also note that with the mechanization of agriculture, family farms are soon going to go out of business, which gave way to bigger farms that are going to become more of like an outdoor grain factory, if anything. And the workers on small farms are going to move east to find work, which is going to create a swell in the industrial workforce. So the West, in some ways, is sort of becoming like the North. They're, becoming a factory, but not really an industrial factory. They're definitely mechanizing, but not to the extent that the North is industrialized. And that gives us a really nice segue into our next slide, which is all about farmers. And most of this should be a review, but again, it is in this chapter, and all of these are really important concepts that you should know about, so I'm including it again anyways. So first, let's start off by reviewing the Grange. This was a movement first organized by Oliver Kelly, and it sought to improve the lives of isolated farmers through social and educational activities. Being a farmer in the West was definitely very tough because they had the machines to do most of the work for them, so they just had to run it. They didn't really need any other people to help them. And especially with being in debt and all of these other problems that are going to pile on them later on, it's really difficult for them to be happy and socialize. So it really just starts off as a movement to help farmers have a better life and just in general be happy. But keep in mind, farmers definitely had other problems. For example, the deflation of a cash crop. So if a single crop they grew decreased in value because there was a lot of supply and, the same amount of demand, like the demand doesn't go up, they had no other crops to fall back on because these are cash crops. They're called cash crops because they are very profitable. So like tobacco, for instance, was a cash crop because when you grew it, it came for a season and it was very profitable in that season and the farmers could sustain themselves. But because of that, when it deflates in value, it's difficult to rely on that single crop for like an entire year. They also experienced droughts and foreclosures. Remember, they were going into a lot of debt to try and buy this machinery to help them with farm work. So because they were paying for the machinery, they couldn't pay for their houses and farms, and this often led to foreclosures, which led to them being homeless and in general just going through a lot of other problems. The Grange movement went on to demand collective reform for farmers so that they wouldn't be completely reliant on trusts and other just big companies that wanted to take advantage of them. So if you remember from a couple chapters back, I talked about the Pittsburgh Plus. That was the extra tax that the railroad companies put on farmers when they tried to send their products up north just because they were farmers. The railroad company took advantage of them that way, and it was a huge financial burden on the farmers. So the Grange, they asked for cooperatively owned stores and for more government regulation and ownership of business so that farmers wouldn't be manipulated like that and everyone sort of had a level playing field. When this didn't really work, Grangers tried to directly enter politics, but after court cases like the Wabash case ruled that states couldn't regulate interstate commerce, the Grange movement sort of lost much of its influence and it didn't really go on to accomplish much. But then we had the Greenback Labor Party, which also tried to reduce laborers' grievances in politics. This also wasn't very successful, and really both of these attempts just go to show how desperate the farmers were to escape the tight grasp that railroad companies and other big companies had on them. They would, enter politics, really do anything they could in their power to show the government that this is an issue they care about and that it's a really important issue, but ultimately they're going to be ignored because obviously they're in the general public and the government at this point really only cares for, the elite and the 1%. And keep in mind, these organizations were only for white farmers because there are really tense race relations, especially in the South, and it's still really a fragile situation. So this already somewhat unpopular movement, at least in the eye of the government, adding, Black and other ethnicities to this entire thing would only make it more unpopular, and also, some of the farmers were racist. So African American farmers had no representation. And so in response to this, African American farmers formed the Colored Farmers Alliance. And this was established after the creation of the Farmers Alliance. Essentially, it cooperatively bought and sold crops to break the grip manufacturers and railroads had on them. And although it initially attracted many members, it wasn't as successful as had been hoped due to the long racial divisions in the South between white and Black farmers. So because farmers weren't able to collectively come together and, work to solve the issues facing collectively the farmers, it really just wasn't successful. And one key takeaway from this entire slide is that farmers will continue to face many difficulties, some of which are addressed and resolved by the government in the following decades. So really, it's not going to be anytime soon, but definitely later on when FDR is president, some of these grievances are going to be resolved. And finally, let's talk about politics and labor. This will again be mostly a review from previous chapters, but they're all super important to know about, so I think it's worth the review. For starters, let's talk about the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party because it's representing the people. It emerged from the Farmers Alliance and was made up of angry farmers who resented the money trust and criticized Wall Street. They called for government ownership of railroads and the telegraph because those were the two major industries at the time, and they did super shady things, as we've talked about in previous chapters, that really were just immense financial burdens on the farmers and the lower class. They asked for a graduated income tax, where the rich would pay the majority of taxes so that that other financial burden was not placed on the lower classes. And finally, they asked for the unlimited coinage of silver to reduce their debt. The Populist Party was actually somewhat successful in politics because they were able to pull 1 million votes for their presidential candidate, James Weaver. The Northeast was, meanwhile, growing more worried that the populists would grow out of their agrarian base and join hands with urban workers in the factories to launch an attack on big businesses nationwide. So if all of these oppressed groups were to come together and attack big business, it would be absolutely detrimental for them because remember, big business is really operating on the backs of these hardworking people. So if they were to join forces, it would be absolutely detrimental for big business. In fact, you see this prediction come true with the Pullman strike in 1894. This is led by the socialist Eugene Debs, and it started after the Pullman Palace Company in Chicago cut wages for all of its workers. So the disgruntled employees started overturning the railroad cars, which paralyzed the railway traffic and, prevented the flow of transportation of people and goods. Federal troops are eventually brought in because it interferes with the delivery of federal mail, and they successfully defeat the strike. So the government is definitely going to be on high alert for these types of strikes, and they have to be very, cautious and alert in terms of immediately suppressing them so as to not give the workers any other hope of really rebellion, and a successful rebellion especially. However, the Populist Party strikes back again with the election of 1896. They support the Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, because he supports inflation through the unlimited coinage of silver, also known as the Cross of Gold speech. So he's basically saying, let's give the people what they want, because ultimately no one wants to be in debt, and this would help our country. That's what he believes. Meanwhile, you have the Republican candidate, William McKinley. He's known for his notoriously high tariff, but is in general well-liked for his years of service in Congress. He ends up being elected president with most of his votes coming from the East, which is where most of the elites and generally wealthy people are concentrated. This is also supported by Marcus Alonzo Hanna, who believed that when business prospered, the people would as well, also known as the trickle-down effect. So basically, he said that the businesses would collect money and that the prosperousness would trickle down to the employees. And obviously this wasn't really true because the businesses, the people at the top of the business especially would hoard the wealth, and the workers really suffered immensely. And one of the key reasons William Jennings Bryan doesn't win, aside from, being supported by the populace, is that certain Democratic gold bugs, as they were known, such as Grover Cleveland, refused to support Bryan because of his silver policy. They preferred a McKinley victory, a Republican candidate, over their own Democratic candidate. So they were like, you know what, I'm going to go over party lines for this. This silver policy is just out of line for me. Bryan ultimately loses, obviously, since the East doesn't really care about inflation. Again, they care about high tariffs because that's where the wealthy people are concentrated, and the wealthy often play a major role in various major industries. So they're investors, stakeholders on the board of directors, whatever. They have some stake in the company and they want to see it prosper. So if you have high tariffs, that means you don't get that foreign competition, and most domestic companies are going to be able to prosper. And really, this election marks the last time that candidates would try to get support from farmers, because although, farmers did make up a good majority of the population, they aren't enough to win over the influence of, the wealthy and the North and other parts of the country. So really, with all of that done, McKinley is now president. And that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like, subscribe, all of that. It really helps me out and lets me know that this video was helpful for you so I can make more videos in the future. So yeah, please subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.